The old conservatory building always smelled the same. It was a mix of wood polish from the gleaming floors, the dusty scent of old sheet music, and the faint, clean smell of piano keys. For her, it was the smell of home, but also the smell of being invisible. She would walk through the grand hallways, her arms clutching a stack of music books to her chest like a shield, and feel like a ghost. The other students moved in loud, happy groups, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. They were confident, polished, and came from families where music was a legacy. She was none of those things. She was there on a scholarship, her talent a raw, messy thing she had nurtured in the quiet of her own small world, far away from the grandness of this place. Her music wasn't for showing off. It was how she spoke when words failed her, a secret language between her heart and the ivory keys. In this world, there was one sun and everyone else was just a planet orbiting it. His name was a constant whisper in the hallways, a name spoken with a mix of awe and envy. He was the golden boy, the prodigy. He didn't walk through the hallways. He sailed through them, his head held high, a confident smile always playing on his lips. People parted for him as if he were royalty. He had been playing since he could walk, his fingers dancing on keys before he could properly form sentences. His playing was perfect, flawless, a dazzling display of speed and precision that left audiences breathless. He was a machine, a beautiful, brilliant machine, and he knew it. He had never looked at her, not really. To him, she was just part of the background furniture, another face in the sea of students hoping to be half as good as he was. She preferred it that way. To be unnoticed was to be safe. That all changed on a crisp Tuesday afternoon in Professor Albright's masterclass. The room was smaller than the concert hall, more intimate, which made it all the more terrifying. 15 students sat in a semicircle of stiff-backed chairs, watching as their peers took their turn on the bench under the professor's critical gaze. When her name was called, her heart gave a familiar little lurch. She walked to the piano, her legs feeling a bit like jelly. She had chosen a Chopin nocturne. It wasn't a piece meant to show off finger speed. It was a piece that bared your soul. It was a conversation in the dark, full of longing and a deep, quiet sadness. As she began to play, she closed her eyes, shutting out the room, the professor, and the other students. She let the music take her away. Her fingers, usually a little clumsy in her daily life, became sure and purposeful on the keys. She wasn't just playing the notes on the page. She was telling a story. She thought of rainy afternoons, of goodbyes, of the feeling of being alone but not necessarily lonely. The melody swelled and dipped, full of a raw, honest emotion that was hers and hers alone. When she finished, the last note hanging in the air like a fragile bubble, there was a moment of complete silence. She opened her eyes, her cheeks flushed. Professor Albright, a man with kind eyes and a mane of white hair, nodded slowly. "A great deal of feeling," he said, his voice soft. "Your phrasing is quite personal. We must work on the technical precision, of course, but the heart is there. And that, my dear, is something that cannot be taught." A few of the students gave polite, quiet applause, but she could feel their confusion. They were trained to admire speed and accuracy, and what she had offered was something else entirely. Then he went up. The golden boy. He sat at the piano with an air of complete ownership, as if the instrument were an extension of his own body. He played a Liszt etude, a piece known for being a monster of technical difficulty, and he conquered it. His fingers flew across the keys in a blur of motion, a storm of perfectly articulated notes. It was astonishing, a breathtaking display of athletic prowess. It was perfect. So perfect, in fact, that it felt cold. It was like watching a robot execute a flawless program. There was no hesitation, no warmth, no story. It was just sound, incredibly fast and incredibly accurate sound. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. It was loud and enthusiastic, the way people clap when they've just seen a magic trick they can't explain. He took a bow, a practiced, charming smile on his face. His eyes swept across the room, and for the first time, they landed on her. And in them she saw not admiration, but a flicker of something else, contempt. It was then that he spoke, his voice smooth and clear, cutting through the applause. He addressed the professor, but his gaze was fixed on her. "Professor," he said, his tone respectful but with an edge of challenge, "our friend here has a very interesting approach. It's full of this heart you speak of. But I fear that without the proper technical foundation, such emotion can get lost in a professional setting." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. They were polite on the surface, but underneath they were sharp and cutting. He was calling her an amateur in the nicest way possible. "Perhaps," he continued, a sly smile forming on his lips, "a friendly showcase at the gala would be beneficial. For her, of course. A chance to see how emotion truly holds up against skill. We could even play the same piece. Perhaps La Campanella? It would be a wonderful learning experience for everyone." A hush fell over the room. Everyone knew what he was doing. This wasn't a friendly showcase. It was a public execution. He had chosen one of the most difficult pieces ever written for the piano, a piece designed for pure technical fireworks. He was challenging her to a duel on his terms, on a battlefield where she had no chance of winning. He was going to use his flawless perfection to shine a spotlight on every one of her imperfections. He was going to humiliate her. She felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. All eyes were on her now, wide with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. She could see the smirks on the faces of his friends. She opened her mouth to say something, to refuse, but no words came out. Her throat felt tight, as if she were choking on the silence. He had trapped her perfectly. To say no would be to admit she was a coward, to confirm his accusation that she wasn't a real musician. To say yes was to walk willingly into her own humiliation. The professor looked concerned, but he didn't intervene. The boy just stood there, his smile unwavering, waiting for her answer. He had already won. The silence that followed his challenge was heavier than any sound. It pressed down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. Every eye in the room was on her, a mixture of pity, excitement, and cruel curiosity. She could feel a hot, prickling sensation on the back of her neck. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floorboards and into the quiet earth below. But she couldn't. She was trapped in the spotlight of his making. The professor looked from the boy's smug face back to her, his kind eyes filled with a concern that made her heart ache even more. He opened his mouth, perhaps to intervene, but she knew it was too late. To be saved now would be another kind of humiliation, she found her voice, but it was a small, thin thing, barely a whisper. "All right," she said, the single word feeling like a surrender. "I'll play." A collective, almost inaudible gasp went through the room, followed by a ripple of satisfied whispers. The boy gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if she had just confirmed his entire worldview. He had won before they had even set foot on the stage. He had already broken her spirit. She doesn't remember packing her bag or walking out of the conservatory. The journey back to her small apartment was a blur. The city sounds, the honking cars, the chatter of people on the sidewalk seemed distant, like they were happening to someone else. All she could hear was the roaring in her own ears, a chaotic mix of his laughter, the impossible speed of his fingers, and the word La Campanella repeating itself like a curse. Back in the safety of her small room, with the door locked, she finally let the tears come. They weren't quiet, sad tears. They were angry, frustrated sobs that shook her entire body. She felt foolish, small, and utterly exposed. He had seen her secret, her heart, and he had called it a weakness. The next few weeks were a special kind of hell. The practice room, once her sanctuary, became her prison. The sheet music for La Campanella lay open on the stand, and it looked less like music and more like a complex, terrifying diagram of her own failure. The notes were a dizzying storm of black dots, leaping and darting all over the page. It was a piece built for show-offs, for athletes of the piano, not for storytellers. It demanded speed, precision, and a cold, hard brilliance that was the complete opposite of everything she tried. She practiced for hours until her fingers ached and her wrists burned. But the music wouldn't come. Her fingers, which could usually coax such feeling from the keys, felt clumsy and slow. They tripped over the fast passages, fumbled the intricate jumps. The sound that came out was not music. It was a mess of wrong notes and hesitant rhythms. It was the sound of struggle, and it was humiliating. Every time she messed up, she would hear his voice in her head, smooth and condescending. A wonderful learning experience. He was out there, somewhere, probably playing the piece flawlessly, without even breaking a sweat. The thought made her feel sick. The pressure wasn't just in the practice room. It followed her through the hallways of the conservatory. She would walk past a group of students, and their conversation would suddenly drop to a whisper, only to erupt in laughter after she had passed. She knew they were talking about her. She became an expert at avoiding eye contact, at staring at the floor as she walked. One afternoon, she was walking past one of the larger rehearsal rooms when she heard it, the dizzying, impossible cascade of notes from La Campanella. It was him. He was practicing, and he wasn't alone. She could hear the appreciative murmurs of his friends inside. He wasn't just preparing for the duel. He was turning it into a performance, a celebration of his own superiority before the main event. She stood frozen in the hallway for a moment, listening to the perfect, effortless sound, and felt a wave of despair so strong it almost brought her to her knees. She was a ghost in her own life, and he was the king of the castle. Doubt began to creep in, a poisonous vine wrapping itself around her heart. Late one night, after another disastrous practice session, she slammed the lid of the piano shut. The loud bang echoed in the small room, matching the fury in her soul. She sank to the floor, burying her face in her hands. Was he right? Was her heart just a cheap trick, a cover for a lack of real skill? Maybe she wasn't a musician at all. Maybe she was just a girl with some feelings who had stumbled into a world where she didn't belong. The thought was so painful it felt like a physical blow. She had always believed that music was about connection, about sharing a piece of your soul. But what if it wasn't? What if it was just about being faster, louder, and more perfect than everyone else? If that was true, then she had nothing. She was a fraud, desperate, and on the verge of giving up completely. She did the only thing she could think of. She went to see her old mentor, the professor with the kind eyes. His office was tucked away in a forgotten corner of the building, a cluttered, cozy space that smelled of old books, pipe tobacco, and wisdom. She didn't tell him about the challenge or the humiliation. She just sat at the old upright piano in the corner of his office and played a few bars of the Liszt piece. It was just as clumsy and full of frustration as it had been all week. When she finished, she didn't say anything. She just sat there, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The old professor was quiet for a long time. He didn't offer any technical advice. He didn't tell her to practice harder or to try a different fingering. He just sat in his worn leather chair, looking at her with those kind, understanding eyes. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft and gentle. "Why did you start playing the piano?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. It was so simple, so unexpected. She didn't know how to answer. He continued, "Before you came here, before you ever worried about technique or competitions or what other people thought, why did you sit down at the piano? What story does your music tell that his cannot?" She left his office without answering the question, but it followed her out of the room and down the hallway. It echoed in her mind all the way home. What story does your music tell? She thought back to the old, slightly out-of-tune piano in her family's living room. She thought about being a little girl, feeling sad or lonely or happy, and sitting down to find those feelings in the music. She wasn't trying to be perfect. She was trying to be understood. The piano was her best friend, her diary, the one place where she never had to pretend. The music she played wasn't for an audience. It was for herself. It was honest. It was real. That night, she walked into her practice room and looked at the list sheet music still open on the stand. For the first time, she didn't see a terrifying test of her skill. She saw a stranger's language. It was a brilliant, dazzling language, but it wasn't hers. And she realized with a sudden, breathtaking clarity that she had been trying to tell her story in someone else's words. She had been trying to win a fight on a battlefield he had chosen, with weapons he had designed. She could never win that way. She would only lose herself. A sense of peace washed over her, so profound and unexpected that it almost made her laugh. She walked over to the piano, reached out, and gently closed the book of sheet music. She pushed it aside, leaving the stand empty. She was not going to play La Campanella. She was going to play something else. She was going to play her own music, tell her own story. The fear was still there, a small flutter in her stomach, but it was no longer the fear of failure. It was the thrilling, terrifying fear of freedom. He had set a trap to humiliate her, but she had just realized she didn't have to walk into it. She could build her own stage. The night of the gala arrived like a sentence being carried out. The grand hall of the conservatory, usually a place of echoing practice notes and hurried footsteps, had been transformed. It was bathed in the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, their light reflecting off the polished marble floors and the gilt edges of the ornate picture frames. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, the rustle of silk dresses, and the low, excited murmur of patrons and critics who had paid good money to be entertained. For her, it felt like walking into another world, a world where she was an imposter. She wore a simple dress, a loan from a kind roommate, and felt plain and out of place amongst the glittering crowd. Every whisper seemed to be about her, every sideways glance a judgment. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the path to the wings of the stage, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Center stage, under the glare of the spotlights, sat two grand pianos. They looked like two sleek black beasts waiting for a fight. One was for him, the other for her. From the side of the stage, she could see the rows of seats filling up, a sea of expectant faces. She saw the professors in their formal academic gowns, the critics with their notepads ready, and her fellow students, their faces a mixture of sympathy and morbid curiosity. And then she saw him. He was in the crowd, moving with an easy grace, shaking hands and smiling. He looked completely at home, a king in his castle. He caught her eye from across the room and gave a small, almost invisible nod. It wasn't a gesture of encouragement. It was a gesture of finality, a signal that the end was near. He was called to the stage first. The applause was immediate and warm. He walked to his piano with a confident stride, not a hint of nervousness about him. He sat, adjusted the bench with a practiced flick of his wrist, and let his fingers rest on the keys for a moment. The room fell silent. And then he began to play. La Campanella. The sound that erupted was a dazzling, dizzying assault of notes. It was exactly as she had feared, and even more. His fingers were a blur, a whirlwind of motion that seemed almost inhuman. He attacked the piece with a fierce, athletic energy, conquering every single note with breathtaking precision. The famous Little Bell theme echoed throughout the hall, clear and sharp, repeated with a speed that defied belief. It was a spectacle, a feat of superhuman skill. The audience watched, mesmerized, as if they were witnessing a high-wire act without a net. When he finished, the final note hanging in the air with perfect clarity, the hall erupted in applause. It was loud, enthusiastic, and full of admiration for his incredible talent. He stood and took a bow, his face beaming with the glow of victory. As he walked off the stage, he passed her in the wings. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her, a small, pitying smirk on his lips. The look said it all. Good luck trying to follow that. And then it was her turn. A hush fell over the room as she walked out from the wings. The journey to the piano felt longer than any road she had ever traveled. The single spotlight felt hot and intense, exposing her for all to see. She could feel the audience's skepticism, their pity. They were expecting a massacre, a sad, slow follow-up to the fireworks they had just witnessed. She sat at the bench, the smooth, cool wood of the piano a familiar comfort under her fingers. She looked out at the crowd, at the sea of faces waiting for her to fail. Her eyes found the old professor in the third row. He gave her a small, encouraging nod. She took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs, and leaned toward the microphone. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. I will be playing Balladno, one by Frédéric Chopin. A wave of whispers like a sudden gust of wind swept through the auditorium. It was not the piece they expected. It was not the piece he had challenged her to play. In the wings, she saw him stop dead in his tracks. The confident smirk didn't just fade from his face. It shattered, replaced by a look of utter confusion and disbelief. He had planned for everything, but he had not planned for this. She had refused to play his game. She had changed the rules completely. She closed her eyes, shutting out the world, and let her fingers find the opening notes. The music that began was not a storm, but a question. A soft, hesitant melody that seemed to be searching for something in the quiet of the hall. It was full of a gentle sadness, a feeling of longing that everyone in the room could understand. It was the sound of loneliness, of a quiet walk in the rain. The audience, which had been poised for a technical failure, found itself leaning in, drawn in by the raw honesty of the sound. She wasn't showing off her speed. She was sharing a piece of her soul. Then the music began to change. The gentle questioning grew into a more passionate, desperate cry. The notes came faster, not with the cold precision of his performance, but with a fiery, emotional intensity. It was a story of struggle, of a battle being fought. Her fingers flew across the keys, but it wasn't a blur of athleticism. It was a dance of passion. You could hear the fight in every chord, the determination in every run. It was the sound of her own struggle in the practice rooms, her own battle against self-doubt. The hall was completely silent now, spellbound. People weren't just listening. They were feeling. An old man in the front row took off his glasses and wiped a tear from his eye. A young couple in the back reached for each other's hands. The music was speaking a universal language. The language of the human heart. The piece carried them through a storm of emotion, through moments of breathtaking beauty and heart-wrenching despair, before finally finding its way to a quiet, peaceful resolution. The final notes were soft and simple, a whisper of acceptance after a long and difficult journey. When her fingers lifted from the keys, the last chord faded into a profound and stunned silence. It was a silence so deep and so complete that it was louder than any applause. No one moved. No one spoke. They just sat there, held in the grip of what they had just experienced. For 3 long seconds, the world was silent. She had not just played the piano. She had reached into the chests of every person in that room and touched their hearts. And in that silence, the golden boy in the wings finally understood. He had challenged her to a duel of skill, but she had just won a war of souls. The silence that followed her final note was a living thing. It wasn't the quiet that comes after a forgettable performance, a polite pause before the obligatory applause. This was a heavy, sacred stillness. It was the sound of 100 hearts holding a collective breath, afraid that any noise might shatter the fragile, beautiful thing that was hanging in the air. In the wings, the golden boy stood frozen, his confident posture melted away. He was a statue carved from shock. He had expected failure. He had prepared for a clumsy, emotional mess that he could contrast with his own perfect execution. But this was something he had no defense against. It was a language he didn't speak, a power he couldn't comprehend. The first sound to break the spell was a single, slow clap. It came from the 3rd row. It was the old professor, his kind eyes shining with a pride so bright it was visible even from the stage. His clap was not rushed or loud. It was deliberate, a single, clear note of validation in the vast quiet. It was a seal of approval. Another person joined in, then another. Soon, a wave of sound began to build, not the polite, rhythmic clapping for a well-executed piece, but a raw, emotional surge. It grew and grew until the entire hall erupted in a thunderous ovation. It was a roar of feeling, a sound of people who had been taken on a journey and were now grateful for the trip. People were on their feet, their faces flushed, some with tears streaming down their cheeks. They weren't just applauding a performance. They were thanking her for her honesty. She sat at the piano bench, stunned. The wall of sound washed over her, and for a moment she couldn't understand what it was for. She had been so lost in the music, so wrapped up in telling her own story, that she had forgotten there was an audience at all. She had played not for them, but for herself, as a way of surviving the night. To be met with this overwhelming response was overwhelming. Slowly, she rose from the bench, her legs feeling unsteady. She turned to face the crowd and gave a small, awkward bow. It wasn't the practiced, graceful bow of a seasoned performer. It was the humble gesture of a girl who was as surprised by the reaction as anyone else. In the wings, the scene was a stark contrast. The boy's circle of admirers, who had been patting him on the back just moments before, were now staring at the stage, their faces filled with a wonder he had never received. His performance, which had seemed so brilliant just minutes ago, now felt like a distant memory, a flashy but empty spectacle. He watched as the critics in the front row put down their pens and looked at each other, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief. He knew what they were thinking. They weren't writing about flawless scales or perfect tempo. They were writing about soul. And they were writing about hers. A cold dread seeped into his bones. He had set a fire to burn her, but the flames had engulfed him instead. The humiliation he had so carefully crafted for her was now his, and it was 1,000 times worse than anything he could have imagined. He wasn't just beaten. He was erased. As she walked off the stage, the applause followed her, a warm, protective cloak. In the wings, people who had never even made eye contact with her before now reached out to touch her arm, to whisper a few words of thanks. An elderly woman with pearls around her neck grabbed her hand. "My dear," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I haven't felt anything like that since my husband passed. You gave him back to me for a moment." "Thank you." A younger student, a girl who always seemed to be in the shadow of the popular crowd, simply looked at her with wide, worshipful eyes and said, "That was everything." Her old professor was waiting for her, his face beaming. He didn't say, "I told you so." He just put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You told your story," he said softly, his voice full of warmth. And they listened. They really listened. She felt a tear slide down her own cheek, but this time it wasn't a tear of sadness or frustration. It was a tear of release, of acceptance. For the first time since she had walked into the hallowed halls of the conservatory, she felt like she belonged. She didn't have to be a ghost anymore. Her music had given her a voice, and for the first time, people had truly heard her. The golden boy watched this from a distance, a lonely figure in the shadows. No one came to congratulate him. No one clapped him on the back. The world he had ruled with such effortless confidence just an hour ago had shifted on its axis, and he was no longer at its center. He saw her surrounded by a small crowd of genuine admirers, their faces lit with a warmth that had never been directed at him. He realized then the terrible difference between being admired and being loved. He was admired for his perfection, a flawless diamond to be observed from a distance. She was loved for her imperfections, her raw, human truth that invited people in. He had spent his life building a fortress of technique around himself, only to realize that he had locked himself inside, alone. He turned and walked away, not with a confident stride, but with the quiet, shuffling steps of a man who had just lost everything that mattered. The gala was still going on, the champagne was still flowing, but for him, the party was over. The silence that followed her music had not just been an absence of sound. It had been the sound of his world falling apart. The morning after the gala felt different. The sunlight that streamed through her small window didn't just illuminate the dust motes dancing in the air. It felt like it was shining directly into her, warming a place inside her that had been cold for a very long time. The usual knot of anxiety that tightened in her stomach when she thought about going to the conservatory was gone. In its place was a quiet, steady calm like the still surface of a deep lake. She got dressed slowly, not with the dread of a person walking to their own execution, but with the simple, peaceful routine of someone who knew where she belonged. The world outside her window was the same, but she was seeing it through new eyes. When she walked into the conservatory, the change was immediate and palpable. The air itself seemed lighter. The whispers that used to follow her down the hallways were still there, but they had a different tone. They weren't hushed and mocking. They were filled with a new kind of energy, a mixture of respect and curiosity. As she passed by a group of students, they didn't turn away. Instead, one of them, a girl she recognized from a theory class but had never spoken to, looked her directly in the eyes and gave her a small, genuine smile. It wasn't a smile of pity or admiration for a celebrity. It was the smile of one human being acknowledging another. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a key turning in a lock, opening a door she hadn't even realized was closed. The biggest shock came when she saw the main notice board in the atrium. Usually it was covered in posters for upcoming recitals and announcements about library hours. But today, a copy of the city's main newspaper was pinned to the center of it, with a review of the Gela circled in red ink. A small crowd was gathered around it, reading and murmuring. She hesitated, her old fear creeping back, but then she took a deep breath and walked closer. She could see the headline over the crowd's heads, "A Revelation of Soul at Conservatory Gala." She scanned the article, her heart pounding. The critic wrote about her performance with words that took her breath away. He called it a profound and fearless display of musical honesty, a performance that did not just entertain but connected on a deeply human level. And then she saw the part about him. The review mentioned his performance, but it was brief and almost clinical. The preceding list etude was a study in formidable technical competence. It read, "A dazzling display of athletic prowess that, in retrospect, felt more like a prelude than a main event." She read the sentence again. A prelude. He had been the main event his entire life, and now he was a prelude to her. She didn't feel a surge of triumph or a desire for revenge. She just felt a strange, sad sense of rightness, as if a truth that had been hidden had finally been brought into the light. She saw him later that afternoon, from a distance. He was coming out of a practice room, and for a moment their eyes met across the long, empty hallway. He didn't smirk. He didn't look away with contempt. He just looked at her, his face unreadable, and then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod before turning down another corridor. The aura of invincibility that had always surrounded him like a force field was gone. He looked smaller, more ordinary, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, but also like a shield had been taken away. He was just another student again, struggling with his music, trying to find his way. She realized then that she didn't hate him. She pitied him. He had spent his life building a fortress of perfect notes, only to discover that it was a prison, and he had locked himself inside. The changes weren't just in how others saw her. They were real, tangible opportunities. A few days later, the old professor found her in the library, where she was quietly reading a book of poetry. He sat down opposite her, a gentle smile on his face. "There's a spot in the advanced chamber music program," he said, getting straight to the point. "They meet on Wednesdays. They're a good group of kids. They play music because they love it, not because they want to impress anyone. I think you'd fit in." He slid a form across the table. "And your scholarship has been renewed. Full ride." The board was very impressed. She looked at the form, then back at his kind face. She hadn't just survived. She had been invited in. She was no longer a scholarship student fighting to prove she belonged. She was a musician who had been asked to share her gift, but the greatest change was the one that happened inside the practice rooms. She still went there every night, the old, familiar rooms with their scuffed floors and slightly out-of-tune pianos. But now they weren't prisons. They were sanctuaries. The piano was no longer a weapon in a battle or a test to be passed. It was her friend again. She didn't practice the Chopin ballade, trying to recapture the magic of that night. She didn't touch the Liszt etude. Instead, she played new things. She played Bach, her fingers finding the logic and the beauty in the complex structures. She played Debussy, letting the shimmering, impressionistic chords paint pictures in the air. She played her own simple melodies, little fragments of tunes that came to her during the day. She played for the pure joy of it. The music that filled the dusty rooms was no longer born of fear and anxiety, but of a quiet, steady happiness and a deep, unshakable confidence. She hadn't just won a duel. She had found her own voice, and in doing so, she had finally found herself.